Hello and welcome to the Berean Book Club podcast with your hosts Francois Poe and Conrad Rieder, the podcast where we discuss books written by saints both dead and alive to see what they can teach us and the church today and hopefully spur us on in our love for Christ. We're so glad you're joining us.
Well, hello and welcome to the 7th episode of Season 3 of the Berean Book Club. It's good to be back with you guys. We are talking about a book by Mark Vroegop this evening called Dark Clouds of Deep Mercy. It seems like maybe somewhat coincidentally over the last 3 years that the podcast has been going, we've done a suffering book a year. Is that right? We definitely did one last year. We did Johnny's book.
I can't remember in the first year.
I actually don't recall the book list in the first year either. Maybe Confessions counts as a book on suffering.
Maybe.
Suffering under sin.
Maybe.
But yeah, it's been a good book to work through. We haven't done something like this in quite some time, which has been good.
Yeah.
It's different to the one, the suffering book that Johnny wrote as well. It's a little bit more focused on a particular kind of response to God and suffering, which has been good to think about.
I think in a certain sense that there's a difference because Johnny is writing from a personal perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Mark also writes out of a personal perspective, but as a pastor, he's been thinking about what does it look like as I come alongside others, not only in my own life, but through the suffering that I've seen in others and helping them work through that. And so, I think there's a very pastoral thinking in the way he tries to put everything together. And I think even just for me in the past month, listening to this book and then in my pastoral kind of duties that I have, it just like stood out to me. It's like, this book has been really helpful to help me understand lament in a way that I hadn't before, I think, or just a deficiency in my almost vocabulary to speak about sin and suffering that he highlights. And I didn't know that was a deficiency until I could hear someone speak the way that he spoke about suffering and the way in which he speaks to God in it. So yeah, great stuff.
Yeah, no, it's definitely been insightful on that front. It feels new and fresh, some new things to think through.
Yeah, and in a certain sense, you don't expect. I mean, we come to suffering and we ask the questions, but what's the answer to suffering, right? And so we go to Elizabeth Elliot. Suffering's never for nothing. We go to Romans 8. Nothing can work against us, and so. I think we focus on the theological answer to why suffering happens, but he's not that concerned with the why question. Yeah, and I think that's why this book hits on a different level, because you may come to it because you want to understand your suffering, and the answer you get is not this is why the suffering occurred or happened, but this is how you move through your suffering to praise and. It's like, wow, good stuff.
Yeah. Maybe before we jump into the book, the Berean Book Club podcast has always happened under the umbrella of BTI. It's been something we've spoken about a number of times on the podcast. But since our last episode, there have been some changes and so on BTI. It may just be worth chatting about that a bit, saying one or two things.
Yeah. For our faithful listeners who've been with us from the very beginning, you would know that it was actually because of BTI that we were able to start this and to continue to do it. And through God's own providence, He gives and He takes away. And BTI, we've as the board decided that due to certain circumstances financially, it's just not possible for us to continue the way that we have been doing. And so last semester was our last semester that we offered courses there in Stellenbosch, and it's kind of come to an end. But as we reflect over these past 7 or 8 years, it's with great joy that we actually see the way in which the Lord has worked through BTI. You know, we never promised to see the fruit of our labor, but every now and then the Lord blesses you with that. And with BTI, that's been true.
Yeah.
To see men and women go out after they've experienced Christ in the scriptures, I think in a new way that some of them had never seen before. And they're serving in churches all across South Africa, overseas, across various places. And so I'm thankful for the privilege that the Lord gave, at least for me, to be part of BTI, and for us as an organization, the work that He gave us to do for these years. But the Lord builds His church, and that means that sometimes your parachurch organization begins and sometimes it ends, and that's okay. And so we pray that the Lord would continue to bless the work happening in Stellenbosch, and they are in capable hands with the churches that are there now.
What does this mean for the podcast?
Well, we'll see. No, I'm kidding. We are still going strong. I think we're just doing it on our own now, and we are very excited to continue doing this. These books really shape us, but they allow for us to have conversations about different topics that you don't always just bring up, and to think about it on a bit of a deeper level. So just because BTI is no more, doesn't mean the Berean Book Club is going to stop. We're going to continue to release monthly episodes, working our way through our book lists. So do stick around, do read the books with us, do share this with your friends if you think they'd be interested in that. And that's what we're going to be doing.
Cool. Maybe let's climb in.
Yes.
To Dark Clouds of Deep Mercy. The focus of this book on suffering is really around lament. To some of us, that may be a familiar kind of a thing to think about, a thing to talk about. Some of us may not have ever heard the word lament in our lives. What's he on about? What is lament?
Yeah. So, I mean, as you listen to his book, he makes the case that even if you just look at the Psalm book, about a third of this to the Lord in a time of distress or pain or suffering. And so for him, as he speaks, lament is a prayer in pain that leads to trust. So it moves from pain to trust. And it typically, he says, asks two kinds of questions. Where are you, God? And if you love me, why is this happening? And I think that's kind of, if we just think of those two questions, those are questions that everyone who is a Christian has asked in their life. And for sometimes it's like smaller things. Often it's big things, right? But that question is, where are you, God? I thought you were going to show up in this way. Maybe I was wrong, maybe not. But if you loved me, why is this happening? And that's kind of a very universal question. And so it's no surprise that the Bible then speaks of this feeling of brokenness, this feeling of despair, and wants to teach us, specifically, he argues through the Psalms and the Book of Lamentations, how to actually deal with those kinds of emotions in your heart. Sometimes it's less, it's circumstances in general. So on a national level, you're thinking of our country. Sometimes it's on a personal level, thinking of death and loss or whatever the case may be. Sometimes he says it's individuals that cry out. Sometimes it's whole communities that cry out, and different circumstances will dictate that. I found a book here in my shelf as I was working through some of these books that reflected on the St. James Massacre, right? And I thought to myself, in that moment, there's a time of lament, not just for the individuals that were influenced by that, but a whole church crying out, a whole church asking that question, Lord, where were you? Lord, if you loved us, surely that would not happen, right? and he wants to kind of show us the Bible allows us to feel those emotions, and he wants to show us how the Bible actually helps us use those emotions to move from feeling like that to a deeper trust and praise in the Lord. He says there, let me read this quote: "Lament is a path to praise as we are led through our brokenness and disappointment. The space between brokenness and God's mercy is where the song is sung. Think of lament as the transition between pain and promise," which is beautiful. So yeah, that's what he starts the book with. Really, it's like this is what lament is. And he says he thinks it's necessary for us as a church to learn how to lament.
I think this is something which was so striking to me about the opening chapter, is why he feels like this is such a big need for us. He points out two things. The first one you've already mentioned, just how many of the Psalms are Psalms of lament, and a third of 151. I hope there's 151 Psalms in the Psalter. I think there is, but a third of them, and that's essentially Israel's songbook, and not a private songbook. I mean, that's a communal songbook that they'd regularly be singing. A third of those are these kinds of like battles and wrestles with suffering, and then he goes like, think about the songs that we sing in our churches and stuff today. How much of our worship music is characterized by these kinds of questions, by wrestling with these parts of God in our life, in our world, in our churches. And I mean, he makes the observation that we'd probably answer that question by saying very little, if any.
Yes.
Most of what we corporately sing out to God is more on the kind of exciting level.
Celebration, victory.
Yes, it's celebratory. It's victorious. It's not lament.
Yeah.
And he, in his kind of journey as a pastor and wrestling with his own suffering, with the death of his daughter, there's something he picked up on and said like, hey, this is something which is often coming up in the Bible. But so seldom coming up in our lives and our churches. This is something that we need to rediscover, something which we need to learn.
And I think experientially hearing that, I think of my life and I think to myself, you know what, like I haven't been given these words to express my emotions. Of course I've heard, we go to the Psalms because that's where we learn how to express our emotions. Did you hear how David speaks to the Lord? And so it's always there, right? But to think of the depth of our human experience and the various things that come on across our paths, both as individuals and as communities. If you think across the world, what the church is going through right now, at a few places, it's just growing, right? But if you think of the persecution happening in places like China and the things that Boko Haram are doing, and in Africa, you realize that there's a lot of suffering, there's a lot of pain in our world, and Christians are experiencing that as we live in a broken world, and the Bible's not silent, and He wants us to like lean into that. We're missing out if we're not allowing biblical lament to take place. And so he's not saying, he says there's something very Christian about lament, because lament is not just expressing your pain. It's expressing your pain through kind of, in the end, expressing your trust in the Lord despite your circumstance, and it leads to praise, and that's almost only something Christians can do. And so he wants us to say, like, instead of shying away from this, lean into it.
He moves on to kind of, to try and teach us how to lament. And he really does that primarily looking at a handful of Psalms of lament in a bit of a different way, almost asking not so much what is the psalmist saying, but what is he doing? How is he saying that? How can you look at their laments and how do they teach us to lament? How would he answer that question? How do we lament?
In his book, what he would argue as the pattern of lament. And the way in which he does it is by kind of analyzing a whole bunch of these psalms. And he says, as you look at these psalms, you start to pick up on this pattern that exists in almost all of them. And the first is an address to God. The second is there's a complaint about the situation that they are in or he is in. The third is there's a request for God to act. Right, Lord, please deliver us. And then lastly, after it all, before anything has happened, there's an expression of trust or praise. And so he, to kind of clarify that and just simplify it, says there are 4 elements to lament: turn, complain, ask, and trust. And then he goes on to explain each of those 4 as he uses various psalms to do that. So we move from turning to God to complaining about our situation, and then asking the Lord to act, and ultimately affirming our trust in God to act. And we can maybe go into each of those as we continue the conversation. But that is his path that he kind of lays out. So it's just helpful to see if we are reading the Psalms to maybe see pick up on these kind of movements within the Psalm. Sometimes you read the Psalms and you can't really understand how it's all fitting together, but this is a helpful framework for some of them, not all of them, but at least there's the Psalms of Lament.
No, for sure. Brew, let's unpack those. Let's unpack each one of those. How does he give flesh to the process?
So we always say this as we talk about these books, go get the book, subscribe to Everand and listen to it. It would really be helpful. But I thought I'd use Psalm 77 as far as possible just to help us to see this. And for his first one, the idea of turning to the Lord, he uses Psalm 77 verses 1 to 2. And it starts off like this: I cry aloud to God, and he will hear me. In the day of my trouble, I seek the Lord. In the night, my hand is stretched out without wearying. My soul refuses to be comforted. And so he starts off by saying, this is really the first step. And I actually think this is the most difficult step to do. As I've thought about this, he says here, it takes faith to pray a lament, to pray in pain, even with this messy struggle and the tough questions that you face. It's an act of faith saying, even with all this, I can still turn to God. And that it's difficult. There are you've maybe got really strong questions, you maybe got really strong complaints, and nothing makes sense to you. And in a certain sense, you feel there is no way I can bring this to God. Maybe even it's because of your own sin, right? There's lots of reasons why, but he helps us to see here. Listen to this quote: giving God the silent treatment is the ultimate manifestation of unbelief. Despair lives under the hopeless resignation that God doesn't care, he doesn't hear, and nothing is ever going to change. And I thought, that's so helpful. It is the most difficult thing is in the situation, as your emotions are all over the place, as you're feeling way down, there's a sense in which that first step of just opening your mouth and crying out to God before you say anything else, just that act of saying, God, you there, and I know you hear me. You know, as the psalmist says, I cry out aloud to God, and he will hear me. In the day of his trouble, I seek the Lord. So that's the first.
I think that's so helpful. It's something when we read those psalms that you almost glance over because we know that they're prayers. You assume they're addressed to God, and so you don't really read into that or think more about that. But the fact that there's a running to God in the first place, even if it's a wavering trust or a doubt, not a firm trust, it displays trust, because in those moments we go to places that we believe is going to take that feeling away, or that's going to be able to offer some sort of a help, whatever that is. You know, whether that's some kind of an addiction or whether it's some kind of an escape. We, in those moments of suffering and pain and stress and whatever, we go to places that we believe is going to offer some sort of solution. And so running to God with it expresses, even if it's in the smallest way, expresses a trust that he'd be able to help. He'd be able to do something. And not running to him expresses the exact opposite. We don't actually believe.
And I think it was helpful for him to point that out, because you're right. It's just assumed, but that is the first step. And I've seen it in my own life, and I've seen it in other people's life as well. It's just, no, I don't think God cares about this. And I don't know if God really cares about me and my situation. God's busy saving the world. But this is helpful. You can go to God. That's the first step. Just go to God. Even if you don't know what to say, just turn to him. It is the start of this process, turning that pain into praise. And so don't stick it out on your own. Turn to him. But it doesn't end there. This is a process. So the next kind of part of the pattern is to complain. He wants to show that the complaining element is a very central element of lament, because we have to voice the kind of the pain that we are experiencing. It's a way to acknowledge that suffering, and I want you to know that it's there. Of course, he already knows, but it's a way to vocalize those emotions, to say, this is the depth that I am feeling right now. From this point, he moves on to say, well, in light of this immense situation that you find yourself in, ask that God would act. Ask that God would act again. So there's this move from turning to the Lord to saying, as honestly as you can, this is the situation, this is what I'm feeling right now, whether it makes sense or whatever the case may be. Lay it on the table, and then ask God to act. Like boldly come to him and say, Lord, we pray that you would act. So that's kind of the third step, is the asking God to boldly act. And then lastly, and I think this is really where this idea of lament moves from a pity party to like a real sanctification, real renewal of your
something
heart.
which changes you.
Yes, and that's when you turn in trust. And I think this is the ultimate expression of faith, is to say, the Lord can hear whatever I have to say to him. In reverence, I come before him, recognizing that he has revealed himself as a compassionate God who loves his people, who allow his people to speak to him, to come to him. So Lord, I'm turning to you. The world that I'm experiencing right now doesn't make sense. I think it's unfair that I'm being treated like this. Will you act and bring about deliverance? And then it says, yet I will trust in the Lord. So that's the fourth part is to reaffirm your trust in the Lord, reaffirm that He is God, reaffirm His character, reaffirm His promises, reaffirm His actions that He has already done, and allow that to shape your heart towards a posture of praise, and to strengthen you to take another day, hour, minute, but to move forward and not to just live in your complaint. And I think that's a very helpful thing, to just recognize that. I don't think lament is saying, okay, day one you turn to God, day two you complain, and day three you ask, and day four you trust. It's this process of lament. So every day, every opportunity you have is to move through that until you actually just grow in accepting the situation that you find yourself in, possibly, but trusting God more and more, praising Him, finding joy in your situation, as is the case that we see in Lamentations. That doesn't really, the situation doesn't necessarily change, right? But it's in that situation that he can find true hope that sustains.
This last part of the step is so helpful, because for the way in which he speaks about it, without this isn't lament. It's almost as if the entire process can take place, and without this last step, it's not allowed to be classified as a lament. It's just a complaint up until this point, until there's the yet or the but or the however. He quotes on laments and so on, who picks up and says, like, if you go read the Psalms of Lament, you'll see those three conjunctions coming up so often: the yet, the but, and the however. And it's that shift from the complaint to the trust, to saying, this is how I feel, but yet, however, this is who you are, this is what you've done, this is what you've promised. And that shift, that yet and but and however, is the moment of trust. However weak that may feel, what you're trying to do when you're lamenting is bring yourself to hold on to those things, not show that you are doing such a fantastic job at holding on to those things. This last point was particularly insightful for me.
Learning to lament, he says, helps us keep trusting God. Through turning to God in prayer, laying out our complaints, and asking boldly for God's help, we are led to a place of trust in God, who cares for us and hears us. That's kind of his pattern. That's his hope, that you move through this lament process, and ultimately trusting God more and more. The next kind of thing that I wanted to mention, just which I thought was helpful in this book, was actually very much linked, as you were answering that suffering reveals our idols to us, because it reveals the places that we have kind of trusted in instead of God and His promises and His character to sustain us or to keep us safe, or whatever that wants us to learn from lament is to delve into what caused me to feel the way I'm feeling. Why am I so unhappy with this situation? And now sometimes it's not because you've trusted in idols, right? Sometimes there's just real situations that happen, but it helps you recognize the brokenness and futility of everything else other than God. And so in Lamentations, I think he uses Lamentations 3 and 4 to kind of deal with this, and he shows how the Israelites trusted in these things to keep them safe. So financial security, other people as saviors, craving cultural comfort instead of like obeying the Lord, idolizing spiritual leaders. If the king will obey, we'll be fine, and presuming on divine favor. And those are just 5 of the things he kind of mentions, but he does dive into each of them in a way that makes it very relevant for us today. And I think often the times when we're feeling the real weight of uncertainty, it's often because of some of these things. It's like, I've lost my job. Let's say, for instance, for me last year, I was thinking a lot about last year and how, in a certain sense, I wish I had some of this vocabulary to express what I was feeling. The man who was funding BTI passed away, and I was left waiting. Right, Lord, will you come through? Why have you allowed this to happen? Isn't the work that we are doing for your glory? What those are the things that are going through your mind, and the waiting is so difficult to wait. And so you just turn from kind of feeling those emotions to acting. Let's just fix it. Let's just try and fix it. And you fail to learn as much as you could from those moments, to express to the Lord, you know what? Things are up and down in this world, and I trusted in this financial donor to keep ETI going. I didn't trust that you are the one that keeps it going, and now you've taken it away. And I repent of the place, finding my kind of comfort there instead of in you. Will you kind of renew my heart? And that's one of the ways in which I think he just shows us, if we follow this process of lament, let's allow our idols to be shown up and repent of that.
I think he's really good here up front. He recognizes that suffering is because of our sin, and it isn't because of our sin. And what he means is that all the suffering in our lives is as a result of sin, capital S. But all the suffering in our lives is not as a result of a particular sin in your life that you've brought up. But he really does a good job at delving into the suffering which in our lives, which is as a result of our sin. And he shows us up really well as he thinks a little bit about Lamentations in the second part of the book. And maybe this is this is one of the places where lament is so impactful in our lives, if you're willing to take it on, where you're able to lament before God even for the sin which you have caused in your own life. You're still able to cry out to God and trust His promises even in those moments. It's one thing for God to show up when His people are suffering, and to have mercy and compassion on them. Maybe a good example is the Exodus. Where they cry out to Him in slavery, and He rescues them. He has compassion on them and He rescues them. It's a whole other thing for God to show up when you are the own cause of your suffering. When you're still able to cry out to God and you've caused your own suffering, and He shows up to rescue you. Like at the cross. That's a whole nother ball game. And He shows so well through Lamentations how we're actually able to do that. How they're in exile and broken and destroyed because of their own unfaithfulness to God, and they're still able to hold on to His promises despite their own cause of their suffering, and He comes through. There's a depth there. There's a transforming power there, which is not just trusting God to have mercy on those who sometimes deserve mercy.
It's a real show of faith to boldly approach God in that way. Maybe as we come to an end, there's lots to say about this book. Any last comments from your side?
I think this has just been a refreshing book. It's a heavy book. It really is. His story himself that he tells in the beginning and throughout the book is enough to put a lump in your throat as he wrestles with his own suffering.
Just insightful for him, and maybe it will be for us and for some of you as well. The moment you start opening up about your own suffering and learning to lament in this way and speaking like this about God with other people, I think he realized how many other people are going through those kind of things, and also there's a hunger to deal with suffering in a way that is life-giving, especially in moments where there's loss of life or just like pain and hurt. And so let other people in your suffering and show them this, because it could be a real place of help and life for the people around you. There's a lot of people around you who are facing deep battles that you maybe not even aware of, and opening up about your own suffering allows them to speak and gives them the opportunity to also learn to bring it to God and to turn it to praise.
Yeah, that's good. We'll be swimming in these waters maybe for a little bit longer, as next month we tackle untangling emotions. Somewhat in a similar vein, at least touching on some of the things that this book touches on as well. That is by
Alistair Groves.
Yes. He's one of the CCF guys, is that right?
CCF guys.
I'm looking forward to that. There have been a number of folk who I've spoken to who have read it and wrestled with some of that book, which has really sounded like a positive thing. So I'm looking quite forward to spending some more time in these waters for a bit. I'm excited to get stuck into that. So until next time, grace and peace. Thanks for joining us.